I knew something had already changed. It wasn't planned as soon as I looked him in the eyes across the dimly lighted hallway. Wasn't desired, but my husband's son experienced it. He was just another guy living here. Therefore, his presence in this place shouldn't have meant anything to me. But that look, I was frozen in place by the steady measuring, not like a son staring at a stepmother. Location, where I vividly recall my hubby having just departed for another job that day. Journey leaving behind the quiet I had become accustomed to for a long time. The house had always seemed too large and empty, full of expensive decor and well-chosen furniture, but lacking something intangible, warmth, closeness, and connection. Therefore, I occupied myself with daily tasks, activities, in the hopes that diversion would drive away the eerie feeling from earlier. But it persisted, and I could still feel his eyes and how his presence altered our relationship. It wasn't an accident, but it wasn't pointless, because I saw him standing close by as I went through the living room. His arms folded and his body at ease, but there was something in the bookshelf. The way he gazed at me caused my heart to race, not out of fear or revulsion, but in he was aware of something much more deadly, and he also sensed it. Swiftly looked away, but the harm had already been done. My mind was already beginning to twist and wait for it to begin. I observed slight imperceptible changes in awareness when he was at home, the way my attention was drawn to motions that shouldn't have been there, and our silence was no longer neutral, but charged. I reassured myself that it was nothing, that I was just dreaming. I was just mistaking regular human attention for something else during the years of my husband's disinterest. Didn't cause my skin to tingle in that way, or cause my mind to stray too. Shouldn't the irrevocable moment have arrived days later? I was idly washing a glass in the kitchen when I sensed him walk in. I didn't have to look to know that. Before I could even turn my head, the hairs on my arms rose up with the same awareness and presence as he walked. I saw a typical action as it opened the refrigerator and took a bottle of water. 100 times previously, but this time it wasn't typical. The tension and silence were intolerable, weighing heavily like the humidity before a storm, and I turned a basic mechanical motion, but it felt like time stopped when my eyes met his. There was something unsaid in the air between us, yet neither of us moved. Unquestionably, I should have turned away and taken a step back, but neither he nor I did. His face for the briefest moment like a dare. Would I accept it as a test? What was going on? Would I act as though it wasn't there? I looked away first, out of shame, more than terror, as continuing to stare would have been in response, and because I wasn't prepared to provide one, I returned my attention to the basin and my hands. Despite the glass being clean, I shook a little when I cleaned it again. However, I reminded myself that this was only the beginning and that it wasn't over. I was reading too much into meaningless moments in my imagination, but I knew deep down that I became acutely conscious of his presence in the house, feeling his every move, gaze, and unintentional contact with closeness. My husband's absence simply made things worse because of the mental and physical void he left behind. And up until now, I had pretended for years that I didn't feel the emptiness. I made myself pretend everything was fine that morning and went through the rituals of making coffee, emails, laundry, but my hands weren't as steady as they usually were, unfocused. I kept thinking about that glance from the previous evening, how he had maintained eye contact, and how I had sensed it wasn't intended to be this way, and he wasn't supposed to influence me, so I felt I needed to space. So I drove to the grocery store and spent more time than required, browsing the aisles to pick up. I couldn't stay, yet I didn't even need anything to put off returning. He was in the living room browsing through his phone when I came back. When I stepped in, he hardly looked up with one arm carelessly slung over the back of the couch. I felt stupid for a second, like I might have dreamt it. Perhaps I was overanalyzing everything at the time when I heard his voice. Broke the silence. "Did you need assistance with anything?" I hesitated, my heart fluttering a little. His tone and the way he asked were innocuous, and I turned to face him. But no, I understood that a period of silence passed between us, during which neither of us moved, and then he nodded as though acknowledging a tacit understanding, and turned back to his phone. But I sensed a change in verification that I wasn't dreaming that night. I lay awake and hardly slept. I woke up staring at the ceiling, my body rigid, my thoughts tangled, and I detested the way my mind kept trying to circle back to him, his voice and the way he gazed at me. Pretend it wasn't, but I knew in my heart that it was already too. I got up early the following morning in the hopes of avoiding him, and I busied myself I was moving my hands while preparing breakfast in the kitchen, but I made a mistake when I reached into the cupboard for a glass. The room reverberated with the piercing sound of glass breaking as someone knocked it over. After a few seconds of frothing and muttering curses, I heard footsteps, and then he was. When they entered the kitchen, his gaze instantly fell on the shattered glass. "Are you okay?" he asked in a hushed voice. A little difficult to sleep, so I swallowed and nodded. He squatted awkwardly and reached for the bigger shards before I could stop him, seized his wrist and pressed my fingers to his skin. I felt his error as soon as we touched, and I was suddenly aware of. For a second, my fingers felt stiff and deadly. For a careless moment, none of us moved, so I released him without saying anything. Whatever he didn't have to say to clear the air between us, he straightened, he turned and left, without saying anything more, and I stood there with my hands in the trash throwing the broken pieces. My pulse was still pounding where I had touched him, and I was no longer experiencing this. I should have fled since I couldn't deny that this was real and I didn't know how to stop it. I should have shut myself in the room upstairs and waited for the moment to pass, but instead I remained in the kitchen after leaving, but his presence persisted, like the aroma of something hot, and meanwhile, my hand was still tingling where I had touched his wrist, and I kept thinking about how his muscles felt, had stiffened under my fingers, but for a brief moment it was nothing. Reaction, so I pushed myself to move and sweep to find out why I couldn't breathe regularly. As if I could erase the moment and the mess, I wiped the final pieces of glass off the surface, but my hands were awkward. My hold on the sponge was too firm, and my pulse was irregular. This couldn't have happened. By the time I entered the living room, I had persuaded myself that the stress was only in my mind, and that if I simply ignored it, thinking it would disappear. But then I noticed him standing there. My husband's body was at ease as he looked through one of his old books by the bookcase. Unreadable, but as soon as I walked in, he looked up and I knew he sensed it. I also froze, clenching my fingers around the dish towel in my grasp. I should have turned around and averted my gaze, but instead I told myself to take a deep breath and pretend to be normal in order to get past the situation I was stuck in. Absurdly risky idea that had begun to germinate in my head. "You appear." He spoke steadily and casually, yet there was something beneath his preoccupied tone, something intentional. "I'm fine," I said too rapidly, and he didn't answer. He simply watched me a little longer before putting the book down and passing me so closely that I could feel his warmth as he moved, and I assumed he would go out of the room, but instead he stopped right behind me. I swallowed my whole body on high, practically feeling his breath at the back of my neck. Make sure his tone was calm and collected. For the first time, I allowed myself to turn just enough to glimpse his face, acknowledge the fact that I wasn't dreaming this was happening. One-sided, there was something I couldn't define in the air between us, something hazardous. I should have moved aside, made room, and puked a wall anything, but I chose to stand instead. Before I could stop myself, before I could think he was there. Move slowly and deliberately ahead. It wasn't quick or desperate. The beast leaned in my direction, and before I could even comprehend it, his lips brushed into me, causing an error that cannot be undone. Error the instant his lips met. My disregarding all cautions and rational considerations. Disappeared. It was only the gentlest kiss for a brief moment, but it broke everything, and I drew back as though my breath had burnt from moving too quickly. His hands were shaking, his face was inscrutable, and he remained motionless. Spoke, and then as fast as it happened, he took a step back. I should leave him, whispered, and then he left me standing there, my entire world gone. Undone, I clutched the counter and tried to tell myself that my breath was still erratic, having nothing to do with the fact that it had been an accident or error that wouldn't occur once more. But the knowledge that it wasn't an accident and would occur once more, as we were both unable to pretend any longer because the cue had already. I promised myself that after being crossed, I would stay inside the house for the following 2 days, was due to my hectic schedule, which included running errands and catching up on emails, tasks that had been accumulating. But the reality was easier, and I didn't want to deal with I hardly slept at all. And every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the scene reliving in my head. His breath's warmth before our lips met the way. Time appeared to suddenly expand and contract the silent jolt. When we withdrew, it was only a moment in his eyes, yet it altered everything. Attempted to persuade myself that he had forgotten it and that it had no significance for him. But I was aware that when I eventually left my bedroom on the 3rd morning, the house was quiet, and I realized I was running out of options to avoid him. Only the gentle hum of the air conditioner accompanied me as I moved cautiously downstairs, listening for any noise. That would indicate he was present. I entered the kitchen with the intention of finding him, but the area was empty. I let out a long sigh and turned to face the coffee maker, grabbing for a... Nevertheless, I knew he was there without having to look around when I sensed that change in the air. Did I gradually become aware of the noticeable weight on my skin? I turned out of fear of being watched, and he was standing at the kitchen's edge. For a moment, neither of us could read his stiff stance or expression, spoke, and at last he moved forward enough that we could speak. His voice was steady, but I could hear the stress beneath it, so I forcefully swallowed. Nothing to discuss. He regarded me as though attempting to determine whether I truly thought it, and then after a little while he turned to go after nodding, if that's what you wanted. But something inside of me tightened. I wasn't sure what I had anticipated, that he would press me to face the things I already knew, that instead he was offering me a way out, and I should have taken it. I nearly happened, but before I could stop myself, I opened my mouth and said, he made the mistake of standing with his back to me for a considerable amount of time without turning around. And then gradually, his eyes locked with mine, and something about his face made do you honestly believe that I didn't respond because I didn't give you a stomach twist? There was a lengthy hush, since the truth was too risky to be set out. Extended between us before leaving, without saying anything more, and for the first time, something chilly settled in my chest for the first time in days, yet it wasn't over. Not even close to how much it weighed on my day-to-day existence. I made sure we weren't alone by pushing against every notion, turning everything into an exercise and avoidance. When I knew he would be home, I persuaded myself to leave the house in the same room. That distance would make the events disappear, but distance had no effect. Because I wanted that to happen again, and I felt bad about myself, because the issue wasn't simply the minute we had experienced it. Despite the sharp and unrelenting guilt that burned beneath my flesh, I convinced myself that I would never betray my husband, but loyalty and love were two different things. And whatever this was between his son and myself, it was a gradual process that I couldn't understand. Unraveling a soft, persistent tug that I was unable to stop, and then came I had been laying in bed, staring at the ceiling on the night that everything changed. I wanted to go to sleep, but eventually my thoughts wouldn't stop racing. I gave up and slid out of the bedroom, not sure why, pushing back the covers and letting my bare feet touch the cool floor. I simply felt I needed air where I was heading, so I moved downstairs. Cautiously, my heartbeat was loud in my ears, and then as I entered the corridor, I saw him with his back to me, standing at the window, with his hands clasped on the... He must have heard me, because he turned slightly, and our eyes locked on the windowsill. And I realized then that avoidance would not help me, because no, I wanted this, and worse, I wasn't, no matter how hard I tried to resist it or how hard I tried to run. I should have turned around and gone back up those steps locked, knowing that I had the strength to stop it. Myself in my bedroom, but I didn't allow this to happen. In the dark corridor, I stood barefoot and gazed at him as though I had never seen him before. He didn't move, and neither did I, and the heavy quiet between us was filled with something unsaid. I hadn't come downstairs because I knew what was going on. This wasn't just a coincidence. He hadn't been standing there awake in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and we were both waiting for something other than air. What I didn't know, or perhaps I did, his face turned completely to face me. Unreadable, the window's faint light created harsh shadows on his face, making me want to turn away and act as though I didn't see it. Observe how his gaze lingered on me, but I remained frozen and put my heartbeat loudly in my ears. Everything about this was incorrect, but I was unable to adjust myself at that moment, as I had anticipated. He couldn't sleep, and his voice was steady and quiet. I swallowed hard to break the silence. No, he nodded as though that response made sense, and then I paused. I didn't ask him why he couldn't sleep, so I breathed gently while holding onto my shirt like it might support me. Since I was already aware that we were trapped in something too delicate to define, and at last he moved, saying, "I should go," the words should have relieved me, but instead they sent a piercing pang of something else that passed through my chest and felt really near to. I nodded in dismay, not believing I could say anything, but neither of us made any progress. Not immediately, but after a while, he moved past me and touched my arm. It was only a little moment, yet it was enough to give me a sudden acute awareness. I should have retreated, but I didn't immediately. Instead, I allowed. Even though it was only a touch, that second stretch was too long, and then he was gone in an instant, and I stood there with my heart racing, skin scorching where he touched me. I had to put an end to this, whatever this was, before it ruined everything I knew in my heart. The following morning, I stayed upstairs longer and avoided him because it was too late. I could hear him more than usual, as if I had emails to respond to or tasks to complete. I told myself as I moved downstairs and heard the sound of cabinets opening and closing and footsteps moving throughout the home. I refused to go down, but when I eventually entered the kitchen, I did. He was already there, sipping his coffee and leaning against the counter, as if nothing had happened yet. Everything had altered. I pretended not to be overly aware of him by occupying myself with little chores. At one point, I went for a dish towel, while feigning not to feel the pressure of the previous night against my flesh. And he reached for something nearby at that very moment, causing our hands to briefly touch. I withdrew as well, so that I could recover my breath and twitch my fingers on his. I apologize. I'm almost knocking over my coffee. His eyes met mine for a brief period. Then he whispered, "Finally, don't act the way he did." It sent a scathing and maybe harmful message down my spine, and he departed, leaving me standing there with my hands and heart pounding. I was shaking and realizing that I was losing control for the first time ever. I called a friend, went for a walk, and attempted to appear normal for the remainder of the day. I tried everything I could to forget about the morning, but it didn't work because, in all honesty, I didn't want to ignore it or forget it, and that scared me so much that night that I lay in bed and stared at my chest was constricted by my thoughts. And when I eventually stood up, I wasn't. Not sure why, but the floor felt chilly beneath my bare feet as I walked through the house softly. Feet and I spotted him once more as I entered the corridor, just like last night. Had been waiting, and in the faint light we stood facing one another and said nothing. It felt too loud. Pulsed the quiet, the tension that hung between us thick and unbreakable. And then at last he breathed. My throat became dry, and I realized that this was becoming dangerous. I understand, however, neither of us left or moved, because no matter how often we told ourselves it was a lie, we continued to deny it. Error. The reality was straightforward. We had already overreached ourselves, and there was no. Now that I was facing back, I was barefoot in the dimly lighted hallway, with the cool floor against. I should have turned around, but instead I just stared at him, my skin and body still. Ought should have gone back upstairs, closed the door, and acted as though I hadn't seen him there, but I didn't, and the unbearably thick quiet between us was filled with, he was near the window, his frame outlined something neither of us dared name. His stance was tense, with one palm clutching against the dim glare of the streetlights outside. I felt frozen by the windowsill's edge, which seemed to be holding himself in place. With my heart thumping in my throat, my logical side was yelling at me to get away so I could get some distance. Remove whatever it was before it became irreparable, but my body wouldn't budge. His eyes flitted in my direction, unreadable. There was no anticipation or accusation in his face. He had been waiting, but it was a quiet knowing that made my stomach turn. I realized this now as if I had just gotten out of bed and gone downstairs for The reason I didn't accept the second was that neither of us could stop. I was moved, and I started to say something to sever the thin thread that was tying this moment together, but nothing come out. My mind was too jumbled, my feelings too raw, and at last he let out his voice low. This is becoming hazardous. I felt a chill go through me at how calmly he said it as a reality that I had to accept, not as a warning or a sorrow. I did, and I knew that my throat was dry, but I didn't leave. Know who moved first. It could have been me, him, or neither. We are drawn closer by an unavoidable force, but all of a sudden the distance between us wasn't enough, and I could feel his warmth and the pressure of his focus on me like gravity. I needed to desire to stop this, but all I could feel was he didn't touch me. But there was a steady, unavoidable pull that had been developing for a long time before I had the guts to acknowledge it. However, he was close enough for me to observe the little shift, the tension in his jaw, and the rise and fall of his chest, of his fingers clenching into a fist by his side, as though he were battling something as powerful as the flames. Inside of me, I should have backed off and urged him to go, but instead I stayed, which was the worst thing I could have done. And for the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to ponder what may have happened if I hadn't resisted it. The weight of my grief felt different. Even though sunshine was peeking through the window, I stayed in bed longer than I should have, acting as though I was still asleep. Blinds my mind was still entangled in the previous night's events. My heart was still shaky, and nothing had transpired. Actually, though, I could sense that something had shifted in the way my hands felt. When I eventually got up and dressed, I shook a little and walked more slowly and cautiously, as when I eventually went downstairs, I was careful not to upset the delicate equilibrium that was keeping things together. I assured myself that everything would return to normal because I had visualized the weight of last night. Regular, but then I noticed him in the kitchen, leaning on the counter and sipping his coffee as if nothing had changed between us, but I hesitated when our eyes locked and I realized everything had changed. He debated turning around in the doorway, but it was too late because he had already seen avoidance was no longer an option for me, so I made myself act normal in order to move, like I poured myself some coffee without paying any attention to the distance between us, maintaining the stability of my hands and concentrating on anything other than the stress that was causing my skin to crackle. At some point, I reached for a dish towel, and he did the same at the same time. Hands briefly touched, allowing my fingers to lightly touch his flesh and apply heat. I drew away too quickly, knocking my coffee cup in the process. I muttered, "I'm sorry," as the gentle clatter against the surface felt thunderous. He didn't move, didn't take a step back, and it was hardly audible. The way he spoke caused my chest to tighten, and it wasn't just a certainty that it was something more, a silent affirmation of, I turned away first, forcing myself to say what we both knew but weren't prepared to speak. To take a breath and clear my mind of the reckless thoughts racing through my mind. I couldn't allow this to happen. It did occur, but I felt in my heart that I was losing control, and worse, I wasn't. I tried to carry on with my day as like nothing had changed, even though I was certain I wanted to stop, as if I hadn't relived last night all morning, breaking down every look, every breath, and every unspoken word. Anything transpired between us, I reminded myself that I was in charge and that I could put everything behind me before it became irreversible, yet self-control had never felt. So suddenly, the house was too quiet, and my spouse was still out of the home. There was no safeguard or diversion to prevent my mind from returning to the one thing I shouldn't have pondered. I poured myself into cleaning the guest bedroom, living room, and kitchen, any place that kept me occupied and prevented me from loitering in areas where I might encounter him, but merely as a precaution. I had worked so long that by the time the afternoon turned to nightfall, I had run out of reasons to continue. I was at the sink, pouring myself a glass of water, doing everything I could to escape the inevitable when I sensed him. I didn't hear him arrive from behind me, but I could tell as soon as he walked inside the room. I held onto the counter with my back to him, feeling the change in the air and the way my skin trickled with awareness. I added, injecting a regular pause into my voice. I'm thinking of making dinner. Okay, that was just one word. Breathe. However, it landed strangely, like though he understood exactly why I was. I pretended to be preoccupied with something as basic as dinner turning, while maintaining he was leaning on the door frame with a bland expression. Are you hungry? Arms crossed and observing me with a look that made my stomach knot, I swallowed and turned my head away. Silence extended once more, but this time it was hazardous and charged, and it wasn't working. Avoiding the force by acting like I needed to put some distance between, I hurried past him, because I knew we had to leave this moment before it consumed me. My way to the refrigerator, but the air was too thick, and the distance between us was too short, so our arms grazed a whisper of contact, but it gave me a shock, since I heard his breath catch. Have halted. I ought to have continued, but instead I turned, and we didn't move when we got too close, but the weight of it was, "Yeah, I don't think this is a good idea," I muttered, not realizing my own voice. He didn't respond immediately, but he also didn't back down, did I? And before I had time to reflect, I had to remind myself of all the, "He kissed me," but it wasn't hurried or urgent, which is why this was incorrect. Carefully consider a choice rather than a mistake, and I gave him a brief moment of my time. I allowed myself to forget everything about who I was and who he was. This would imply, but reality struck too quickly, and I gasped. I muttered, "This can't happen," as I became unsteady, and my hands gripped the counter behind me as though it could anchor me. He looked into my eyes and spoke weakly, but he didn't dispute or attempt to persuade me differently. He only nodded once and let out a deep exhale before backing off. He turned and departed without saying anything more, leaving me by myself, but the damage was I had already gone too far and wasn't sure if I could turn back. My heart was still thumping my lips as I lay awake that night, gazing at the ceiling. Still feeling the sting of a kiss I shouldn't have had, I reminded myself that it had been an error that I would overlook, move on from, and repair before it became anything unchangeable, but I knew the truth in my heart and didn't want to forget it. Frightened me more than anything, and I didn't get any sleep that night. I lay still, gazing at the ceiling, as my thoughts repeatedly reenacted the scene. Before our lips met, the warmth of his breath made my heart race so fiercely that I felt like it may shatter me. I promised myself that I could stop it before it became real, but I had allowed him to go this far. Kiss me, and even worse, I returned the kiss. Guilt twisted inside me like a living creature, and I wasn't simply a woman with a secret, and by dawn, my body felt heavy because I had done something that I couldn't undo. Lack of sleep made my thinking sluggish, but I made myself get out of bed and force the home was quiet when I came downstairs, naked with limbs to move in order to operate. I convinced myself that I wouldn't see him and that I could go about my day without his footsteps making any noise against the wooden floor, as if nothing had occurred. But I halted when I got to the kitchen because he hadn't heard me enter yet, so he was standing by the counter with his back to me and his shoulders stiff. Before the weight of it sank, I could pretend for a moment that we were still the same as before the kiss between us, but it went by too fast. He turned, and the moment when our eyes locked, I experienced the silence again, dense and suffocation. I should have acknowledged it and spoken something to put an end to it. Established the border that ought to have existed from the beginning, but I didn't have the confidence to say it. Instead, I stepped over him and steadied my hands while reaching for the coffee pot despite my heartbeat. He didn't move or say anything as he raced, and perhaps that was worse. Words, the lack of justifications, indicated that neither of us was responsible for this. I poured my coffee, holding the mug more tightly than I needed to, then turned to depart, but as soon as I passed him, his voice broke the stillness. Will we discuss I should have lied if I hadn't stopped gasping for air? Dismissed it as unimportant, but instead I muttered, "No," and that's when I knew I wasn't prepared to let it go. The days that followed were intolerable. We moved through the house as two strangers, avoiding one another. I drowned myself in the idea that they didn't breathe the same air and that the same hidden reality was weighing them down. Distractions such as cooking, cleaning, or performing unnecessary errands to get away from the house, but it followed me everywhere I went, kissing me, and felt his lips to mine, the realization that I couldn't undo it, and the worst. That night I stood by my bedroom window, gazing out at the peaceful street under my husband, and I didn't want to take it back. I should have been relieved and anchored by the knowledge that I would soon be home, but instead it felt like a countdown to something I couldn't comprehend because everything had to return to normal once he got home. Didn't a gentle knock on my door cause my breath to catch? My heart began to race, knowing he would be standing in the dark hallway before I ever opened it. Face unreadable, we chose not to speak because at that very moment, the truth, we had already gone too far and the weight between us was too great to ignore. We understood how to stop, and I kept him out of the corridor because the air was dense with something unsaid and potentially harmful. But as soon as I opened the door completely, I realized that the world as I knew it was over, would break. So I took the only action possible and stood there clutching the edge of the doorframe so firmly that my knuckles hurt, making me speak louder than I felt. You shouldn't be here. And even as I spoke, my words sounded weak. Them because I didn't seem to mean them, and I could tell he was aware of it. For a long time, he remained silent while his eyes scanned mine for something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Simply stood with his hands stuffed in his pockets and his body motionless, anxious. Then I know a gradual exhale, and then he turned and went away. I closed the door, and before I could do anything careless, I called. I leaned on him to return him before I could forget all the reasons why this was wrong. My heart was pounding against the wood, and my breath was coming too quickly. What was going on with me permitted this was more than just an error. It was something I was unsure on how to cease. I pretended that the incident hadn't occurred for the rest of the following day. Coffee responded to emails, then took a lengthy stroll just to get outside. My husband was scheduled to be home shortly, and I reasoned that perhaps his returning would resolve this erasing whatever had come undone inside of me. Something had taken root in my chest and wouldn't go away yet upon returning. As soon as I entered the air, I realized I had been deceiving myself. Distinct charge, and I could tell by the slow, steady footfall behind me. Was him. I prepared myself by stealing my look before I even turned around. I turned to face him. This must end. He looked at me for a while, his hands flexing and his jaw taut. At his sides, then halted. His challenge struck a sensitive chord with me. He wanted me to be the one to break this so he could be held accountable, but I swallowed hard and shook my head, wondering how I could have allowed it to begin. There's a pause, a glimmer of something, and my spouse will be home shortly. Why are you telling me that I felt my gut twist when he couldn't read it? I didn't have an answer, at least not one I wanted, and I felt the heat rising up my neck. To speak out. After a lengthy period of silence, he eventually moved aside, giving me his eyes never left mine, as he gave me the space I didn't even know I needed. You're not as certain about this as you act, and the worst part, I whispered. He was correct. I didn't talk to my husband much that evening, and he arrived home fatigued. From work greeted me in the same worn-out manner, kissed my cheek, smiled distractedly, and said, "How's your day?" One day I responded to him with a vague, meaningless response. He didn't notice, or perhaps he did, but I felt like I was suffocating inside. I sat across from him at dinner, watching him go through his emails, but I didn't care enough to inquire. I kept thinking about how strange this felt, while his phone answered texts that seemed to be urgent. How far away I had been for so long, acting as though our lives were okay. But I could now sense the rifts in every discussion, in every stillness, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue pretending for the first time. As the days went by, I convinced myself that to make this better, so I could return to how we were. But the more I tried, the more I realized that I couldn't. The more I realized how little my husband showed me how much someone else did, and the worst thing was that I was unaware of it. I tried to tell myself that nothing had changed and that life could continue, but which aspect of that hurt more returning to the previous state of affairs? But it was more difficult to pretend when my spouse was home. His voice, presence, and routine were all around the house once more, natural as if returning to something known, yet it seemed alien instead. I watched him pass through our house as though nothing had changed, as though I were acting out a part of a life that no longer belonged to me. He kissed my forehead in the mornings and inquired about my day in the morning, as though the walls weren't closing in on me. Evenings, and as he walked by in the kitchen, I hugged him a little bit, and every touch felt awkward. The true betrayal was not because I loved him, but rather because I felt nothing. Was it not the kiss I had with his son, but rather the secret that stood between us couldn't remove, but the knowledge that I had left a long time ago made these days seem to blend together. So I avoided. The only person I should have felt most secure with was him, so I filled my time with chores, errands, or anything else that prevents me from sitting in solitude. I told myself that everything would work itself out if I just behaved normally, but nothing seemed normal. No longer, and I wasn't the only one who observed it one night, while I was standing by grasping the smooth kitchen counter with my palms as my spouse entered. Before I even saw him, I sensed his familiar yet oddly remote presence. I thought he would go about his daily business, get a drink, check his messages, and hardly notice me. There, but this time he paused and said carefully, "Well, you've been quiet lately," so I pretended to be focused while keeping my back to him. "I've simply been exhausted from working on an imaginary activity." Stillness, a protracted pause that went on for too long, and you're certain that's it. My gut tightened at the question, so I managed a tiny grin and turned to face. I could sense he wanted to press, so of course what else could it be? Additionally, there was a brief moment of uncertainty in his eyes, but as always, he, for some reason letting it go, made me feel worse. For days, the burden of everything weighed heavily on my chest, and I told myself that I had a choice, that I could suppress and bury this until it was only a dim memory, but I knew that was untrue. Because each time I walked past his son in the corridor, our eyes would meet and our fingers would touch. Accident. I sensed a reality that neither of us wanted to acknowledge a line we had previously. One night, I was standing in the darkened living room with a cross and one we couldn't uncross. My husband had gone to bed early, and I was looking out the window at the flickering street lights. I should have followed him upstairs and had lain by my side because the home was too silent. He tucked me into the comfort of our bed and allowed the evening to go by without incident, but instead I stayed. But I didn't have to, since I heard light footsteps behind me. Turn around to find out who it was, since the air changed, and I didn't, and the fortitude to battle, and I finally allowed myself to ask the question I had been. Was there ever a version of this story in which I didn't wind up standing here, caught in the middle of this? I couldn't control it. So I turned slowly, my heart pounding loudly in my ears, and our eyes locked in silence. We came to an arrangement, and I opened my lips to say something. I wasn't sure how to prevent this from getting worse. But before I could talk, I had to make The sound of my husband's voice calling my name from above broke. The tension erupted, and both he and I retreated, and suddenly, reality falling. But as I turned my back and headed for the stairs in my life, I knew that this wasn't over, because it had been so meticulously constructed. And perhaps I just didn't want it to be,